Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. This was the advertisement that Mike Kaluta illustrated for the 1973 Comic Art Convention at the Hotel Commodore in New York City, which is now the Grand Hyatt, right next to Grand Central Station. Beautifully illustrated in deco style by Mike Kaluta. I'm showing you this because it was my first comic convention. I was 15 years old that summer. And it was the convention that the first image I saw when I stepped into the giant ballroom marketplace where all the dealers were was a giant blow up of Kaluta's first shadow, which would come out in mid-July. This was July 3rd or 4th. And yes, one of the greatest covers of all time, one of the greatest images of the shadow. I recently did a webinar on it, also on its 50th anniversary, back on July 12th, I believe. Well, there was another great debut at that same comic art convention. By the way, these were the Phil Suling conventions. He was the center of the wheel that the New York comic convention scene spun around. But the comic fanzine of the time, the one where everybody got their news, was called a Comic Reader. And at that convention, they released their special July convention issue ahead of its usual mailing release. And I'll never forget holding that cover in my hand. Comic Reader was like TV Guide size. And who is this character, Manhunter? I'd never seen a character like that. I'd never seen a costume like that. I had never seen a drawing style like that. And who was the artist? Simonson, with that really cool signature. This is dated May 3rd, 73, so he only did it 2 months before. Later that month, on July 31st, a couple days ago from doing this webinar, came the first issue with this character, Manhunter. Now, Manhunter, if you knew your comic history, was created by Jack Kirby and his partner Joe Simon in the early 1940s when they were working at DC Comics. But this was an all-new Manhunter. Okay, let's open up the issue and take a look at it. Man, I'll never forget being just transfixed by the totally unique look of this artwork. Everything from the Manhunter logo, not your usual comic book block lettering, but it was this single figure of the Manhunter character and that costume. I had never seen a costume like that. When he comes out of the shadows, he looks like this. This is the 50th anniversary of Manhunter by writer Archie Goodwin and artist WALT Simonson on the anniversary of its debut 50 years ago this week. Welcome, everybody. My name is Arlen Schumer. I'm a comic book historian. I did a book about comic book history called The Silver Age of Comic Book Art, about comic book art in the 1960s, the Silver Age, as opposed to the 40s when superheroes started, and retroactively called the Golden Age. It centers on the work of 8 major artists of the era whose works define the 60s itself. And you can see on my title page here, I try to match their very beautiful and unique signatures with a quote from each artist about something that summed up their kind of artistic worldview. And each artist, like Neil Adams, would get a double-page spread introduction featuring a portrait of one of their main characters that they're most identified with, along with another autobiographical image ghosted behind my written text there on the right side. The final page in Neil Adams' chapter kind of sums up the impact his photorealistic style had on comic art. And in my text there, I compare him and contrast him to the great Jack Kirby and his hyper exaggerated anatomy. I took this image from a 1975 art of Neil Adams, kind of a 9x12, beautifully printed, soft cover collection of his great artwork in black and white. I love the cover, colored by Richard Corbin, but this illustration Neil did really sums up the impact of his approach on the world of Marvel and DC superheroes by presenting a fantasy world in such, and like I said, almost photorealistic realism. His model of the superhero, as exemplified by this 1974 back cover of the Action Comics #1 Golden Treasury tabloid size reprint, I think is maybe the greatest single image of Superman ever drawn, but it really defines the model of the superhero that Neil Adams' artwork was most dominant by 1973 when this figure appeared. And I just remember staring at this figure for what seemed like hours and just loving the uniqueness and the newness of it. Masculine yet very relaxed figure. And again, everything about this Manhunter character was just new and fresh and different. Of course, he was co-created by writer Archie Goodwin and artist Walt Simonson. Years later, on this biography page that kind of tells you their basic bios, there's Walt Simonson's self-portrait and portrait of the late, great Archie Goodwin, passed away in 1998. Goodwin was a writer, an editor, even an artist. That's why maybe his scripts were so revered, because he thought and wrote visually. But he made his bones in the mid-60s as the editor for Warren Publications' groundbreaking black and white magazine horror and fantasy anthologies, Eerie and Creepy, beginning in 1964 and 65, when those magazines debuted. But it was his editorship and writing of his war comics title, Blazing Combat, that only ran for 4 issues in 1966. But not only are the stories by Goodwin incredible, covering almost the whole history of war, but the quality of the artists that he used in also in Eerie and Creepy, which is what made those Warren magazines sing, is just almost a who's who of the great comic artists that were available to Goodwin in the mid-1960s. I mean, look at this issue of Blazing Combat. You have a World War I story illustrated by the great John Severin. Then we jump to World War II, 1944, Russ Heath, using himself as a model for his almost photorealistic artwork. Forward to the Korean War, and you have the great Wally Wood illustrating. These are all scripts by Goodwin, and they're all great stories. The Korean War you have here with Alex Toth, the thinking man's artist. And then to the present day, and this is what made Blazing Combat, stories about Vietnam, which at the time, 1966, most Americans didn't even know where Vietnam was or what it was. We had only escalated the war in December of '65. So Goodwin really made his bones at this time. And then he went to Marvel Comics and wrote and edited. So by the time he got to DC Comics in '73, for the first time as an editor, it really made all the news. Everybody was excited. What would Archie Goodwin do editing Batman in his Detective Comics title? Well, in one of DC's house ads that appeared in the early summer of '73, look at the writing here where it says the Manhunter is coming in Detective Comics this summer, just as I promised. And behind the scene #3, and editor-writer Archie Goodwin has picked an artist for the strip at long last. The lucky gent is one Walt Simonson, a new artist whose work is also going to be appearing in Sword of Sorcery. Now, that was a title edited by Joe Orlando, I believe, that started in 1972. And it was DC's attempt to kind of jump on the Conan bandwagon, having been successful over at Marvel Comics. There's a cover by the young Howard Chaykin, who, like Simonson and artists of that type, Mike Kaluta, Bernie Wrightson, that was their peer group. And DC and Joe Orlando put a lot of them to work, giving them their first printed works. In this issue of Sword of Sorcery that appeared, I believe, a month before Manhunter, you have Fafhrd and the young barbarian, and you can see Walt Simonson's style was just offbeat. It was the style of his drawing was very idiosyncratic, and as idiosyncratic as that signature. And I love the fact that he always dated his work, that he did this in March of '73. It was in 1972 that he got his break first at DC Comics. I love the self-portrait that I found on the internet, dated October of '72. But it was around this time that Simonson began hanging out up at Neil Adams' art offices called Continuity Associates. He had an office at the time on 48th Street, I believe, between 5th and 6th Avenues. And there's Simonson on the left, about 25 years old. Jack Abel, longtime Marvel and DC inker that I think rented studio space at Continuity. Pat Broderick, artist. And Ralph Reese, licking the sole of his shoe. Continuity was like the comic book equivalent of Warhol's Factory in a way, and predates Joe Kubert's Kubert School in terms of how many great artists Neil turned out through people working through Continuity. And Simonson was one of them. There's Neil working at his desk in the early '70s at the 48th Street Continuity. And Simonson never lost his connection with Neil, who passed away in 2022. But here's a fairly recent picture at a convention somewhere of Walt resting his hand on Neil's shoulder. I love this picture. But yeah, back in '72, '73, Simonson was just starting to sketch out the costume designs for Manhunter, which you can see even in these early sketches, look nothing like any DC superhero that had come before. And we'll talk about more in detail the various accoutrements that make Manhunter's costume so unique, and that led to, yeah, the black and white original art of the first page of the first installment of Manhunter. And as you went through this 8-page story, everything about it was like nothing we had really seen before. We saw fight scenes, but it was the drawing that was idiosyncratic. It was not standard superhero musculature or figures. There was a style going on here that Simonson applied to everything, and not just his drawing, but his storytelling. In pages like this, we grasp immediately that Simonson had been a student of comic book storytelling that treats comics as if they were almost like film on paper. And that dates back to, of course, the great Will Eisner and his Spirit from the 1940s, this being perhaps one of the most identifiable first pages of any Spirit story that Eisner produced. But Eisner was the first comic artist to really understand the fact that panel to panel progressions dealing with the passage of time and how you break that up in panels is like film, frames of film. And Eisner was the first great writer artist to really teach an entire future generation about how to break down actions in comic book panels. In the early 50s, Eisner's lessons would be carried on by artists like the great Bernard Krigstein at EC Comics, 1953 or 4, Master Race. One of the first, if not the first, comic book story referencing the Holocaust. But it was in this story that Krigstein became famous for learning the lessons of Eisner and breaking up action in spatial panel fragments. I wanted to put Nick Fury's Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. here, but there have been so many homages to his great S.H.I.E.L.D. #1 cover, I accidentally just realized I put a Kim Possible homage cover instead of the great Jim Steranko, but I wanted to show Steranko bringing the lessons of Eisner and Krigstein into the 60s with his Nick Fury Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., this being an example circa 1967, 6 years before Simonson's debut. But just in that progression of the bottom 3 panels, you can see that Simonson grasped this breakup of panels as cinematic film frames. This sequence, silent, just relying on Simonson's beautiful line drawings, his anatomy, but his storytelling, like a movie director, knowing when to switch camera angles, breaking through panel frames like the middle bottom panel of Manhunter's figure. You can see that Simonson had learned from Steranko's famous double-page spread from the first issue of S.H.I.E.L.D. in 1968 that feels like the opening of a James Bond film. But again, you can see how Simonson, from his very first issue, had mastered this aspect of comic book storytelling. When we get to the 8th page and the denouement of the story, we're treated to this beautiful end sequence. And man, what an impact those 8 pages made. I remember reading in the letters page of that issue, Archie Goodwin introducing himself to the readers, thanking Julie Schwartz, the previous Detective Comics editor who had been there since 1964. Goodwin goes on to compliment the Batman artist of the issue, the great Jim Aparo. But then at the end, he talks about my second stroke of luck on the book's artwork was a fella called Walt Simonson. With Walt, I was somewhat more perceptive than with Jim Aparo. I first saw his work last year and told him I could use him, but that I thought his style would pretty much limit him to science fiction type subjects. Each job Walt did after that seemed designed to prove my estimation wrong. And now here we are doing Manhunter together. Walt is 26 years old and a graduate of Rhode Island School of Design. His degree project was to produce a comic book, a sci-fi opus called The Star Slammers. This was the sample of his work I saw. I think he's got a great future ahead for him in comics. I hope Manhunter will prove to be an important part of it. Here's an example of that Star Slammers degree project that Goodwin saw. And man, now that we know Simonson's style, his mature style, it does seem very primitive, but kudos to Goodwin for seeing that spark of creativity. Look at how Simonson, almost a decade later, would revise that splash page when he would produce Star Slammers as an actual graphic novel for Marvel's graphic novel line, 1981, I believe. You can find the complete collection of his Star Slammers, a great body of work that's been collected. But I remember reading this, and I was in 10th grade at the time. I was the class artist in high school, and I was only thinking about, where do I want to go when I graduate? Do I want to go to a university with a good art department, or do I want to go to an art school? And yeah, there I am in 10th grade, the class artist. And Simonson's work, hearing about Rhode Island School of Design, I just thought, man, if they could turn out an artist like him, well, that's where I want to go. Yeah, there's me in my 1976 Huckapoo silk shirt with polyester pants, getting a cash award for having the best New Jersey high school senior art portfolio. That's the great David Levine on the left side of the picture, presenting the award with me. And yep, you can see some of the samples behind there are typographic, because I also won the Arrow Typographic Award, and all influenced by guys like Steranko. I didn't really know, I was just learning about Eisner at the time, but yeah, it was Steranko and Simonson. And I ended up going to RISD in the fall of 1976 because of Walt Simonson. So that's my personal interaction with Walt Simonson and Manhunter. But back to the second issue, you can see DC changed the format to the 100-page super spectacular for a whopping 50 cents. But it still had a brand new Batman story illustrated by Joe Paro up front, and it had the backup by Manhunter in the back. Nice Mike Kaluta circular inset cover there. And there is the splash page of installment 2. Again, I like how Simonson dated his work. This was done in June of '73, only a couple months before this issue came out. Notice how this sketch is also dated June of 1973. So there's Manhunter being attacked by a raging tiger, and look at how Simonson shows us the Bundy dagger. These are all unique weapons that we had never seen before, wielded by any superhero or protagonist. And again, another example of Simonson's clear, concise storytelling. Whether Manhunter is fighting beast or man, Simonson's storytelling is cinematic. I love his almost Sergio Leone close-up of Manhunter's steely gaze in panel 3. And then, of course, the shuriken, the star-shaped throwing blade. These have become commonplace in movies ever since, but in comics, we had never seen this kind of stuff before. It was all new to us. Well, at least it was new to me. Nice figure of Manhunter coming over the top in the top panel. And again, just silent fight scenes with a lot of energy and just that offbeat Simonson drawing style. There was an aspect of his style that might even be considered ugly. Hello. I'm back, folks, sorry. But yeah, I love this montage illustration as we come down to the conclusion. Another beautiful cinematic sequence by Simonson. And just more of that beautiful lettering and type design that was both reminiscent of Steranko and Will Eisner. The next issue had one of Neil Adams' last great Batman covers. This is appearing March of '74. Remember, comic books are dated almost 3 months in advance to encourage retailers to keep it on the stands longer. So that means this issue came out late December, probably early January at the latest, probably late December of 1973. Look at this beautiful lettering by Simonson, The Resurrection of Paul Kirk. August of '73 is when he draws this. So it was in this issue that Manhunter reveals his origin to Christine St. Clair, his partner there. And you can see that Simonson draws the costume of the 1940s Manhunter by Kirby and Simon. So you can see in this example. And we find that he's Paul Kirk, big name game hunter, as you've been reading while I've been talking. But yeah, he gets trampled to death. Beautiful Simonson drawing of the elephant here, full page. And the last thing I heard was a sound like the wings of the angel of death flapping, beating as she drew near. Then I died. But Manhunter is resurrected, it seems, a couple of pages later. And who has done this? This is the sanctuary from which the council operates, an organization of the world's top minds. 10 of us banded together near the end of World War II, when the creation of the atom bomb made it obvious man could now eradicate himself and his planet. We've dedicated our skills and advanced knowledge to seeing this doesn't happen. With pollution, overpopulation, racial and territorial strife, no small task. Nonetheless, the council's goal is to save the human race from itself. If this sounds familiar to so many apocalyptic and dystopian future stories, of course, the road to hell is always paved with good intentions, right? Obviously, the experiment went wrong. When Christine St. Clair questions who are all these Manhunter-like clones, he says, I guess we're all brothers of sorts, and they're not from any rival organization. They're the council's enforcement branch, the branch I was frozen and preserved a quarter of a century to head. The plot thickens. But again, I love that very human drawing of Manhunter and his anguish. Just beautiful line work, so expressive. Turns out that Damon, her boss, is obviously a traitor, but Manhunter saves the day. There's more to my story, Christine. Hear me out while we go after Mr. Nostrin. And again, nice little lettering there with the classic Manhunter type gun. Another Jim Aparo cover in the following issue. One of my favorite splash pages, or in this case, page 1 of this installment of the Manhunter, as Damon attempts to run them down. I love Simonson's stylization of the Jeep and the lights, very graphic. That is another hallmark of Simonson's work. And if you just look at his pen and ink work, this was just not the kind of Neil Adams influence inking of the time. This was Simonson's organic, very earthy drawing, and yet never sacrificing classic comic book storytelling and pacing. Follow this next page sequence. Shrip, scritch, poof, whoom. I hope I did that one justice. But yes, I mean, what a beautiful page by Simonson that's just alive with action and energy and sound effects. Another lesson that Simonson had learned from guys like Will Eisner, who really brought sound to life on the pages of his Spirit 20 years earlier. In 1988, I convinced the trade magazine, the graphic design field, Print, to devote a special issue on comics. I designed the cover. You can see the letters COMICS, the 6-panel window pane design, the comic book page as a window onto a unique world or worlds, and the 3 colors, the primary colors in black of the comic book press. I also wrote one of the articles about how mainstream superhero comics by 1988 had changed, especially with The Dark Knight and Watchmen signaling a sea change in the look of, as you can see, the standard Neil Adams character. And you can see below that Superman image, I've got a Kirby Captain America and Thor contrasted to Simonson's Thor, which we're going to talk about later on in this webinar. But in the article, I say this about Simonson, that he was one of the first artists to introduce an unorthodox drawing style to mainstream superhero comics with Manhunter, a backup feature. A graduate of art school design with a degree in illustration, Simonson couldn't throw off his academic influences. His line was looser, sketchier, more graphic. His lettering of sound effects had a typographic feel and was carefully designed into his panel compositions, unlike the customary oversized pop art pows and zaps. The influence his work in Manhunter had on the rest of the field was an inverse proportion to that feature's second string status. In that article, yes, I print that womb panel from that great sequence in this issue. And look at how, when he talks about how he was bred for 25 years, the council reveals that it keeps all these human beings isolated in their own kind of test tubes. Now, if that sounds like the Matrix, 25 years later, 1998, you got that right, because this is essentially what the council was doing if you take the time to read the story in one of Simonson's incredible full-page images in the Manhunter series. And just look at the way Simonson paces this fight scene on the left side of the page. As your eye goes down the page, on the right-hand side is Manhunter leaping from a window and dropping to the ground. But you first had to read the fight scene on the left before he jumps out of the panel. There's the beautiful page that just again shows you Simonson's mastery of the comic book storytelling form. And there it is in pure black and white. I love that panel on the right, that vertical panel, just beautiful. And then we meet. Let's see, I just blanked on this guy's name. Koli Mabea, black man who is a technical whiz who, as Manhunter explains here, had a long relationship with, as Mabea explains here, he was manufacturing arms for various rebel groups he supports. His money put him through Oxford and enabled him to make all those groovy weapons. He proceeded to demonstrate how well he learned his craft, or rather, considering the results, his art, by creating the unique arsenal I specified. And there it is, very Steve Ditko Spider-Man-like, explaining, very diagram-like, all of Manhunter's attributes. And again, this being 1973, it is also 26 years ahead of the 1990 Oh, no, I'm sorry, 16 years ahead of the 79 debut of the Black Lucian Fox, who is also the tech expert who would make all of Batman's wonderful toys, as the Joker once called them. And yeah, there's the issue, January of 79, with a Jim Aparo cover. But back to the final page of this installment. I believe we're installment 4, I think. And the final page ends with just another beautiful typographic treatment by Simonson of Cathedral Perilous. Okay, next issue, another Aparo cover. But perhaps Simonson's most beautiful page 1 with what is called a color hold. Well, first look at the page in black and white, sorry. But you see Simonson and the printer put the black line art on a separate overlay and add it to the magenta plate to print solid magenta. And that's called a color hold. And that's how you get beautiful effects like this. Now, that particular church with the dome is based on a real Park Avenue church, St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church on 50th Street and Park Avenue, built in 1918. And that's what Simonson used in his beautiful architectural rendering on the splash page of Cathedral Perilous. I love how on the top of this page, you get one of Simonson's great sound effect usages and the kind of psychedelic transition here that once again reminded me, all of us really, of Steranko's work from 5 years prior, and how Simonson, influenced by guys like Steranko, were able to do panels like this. Now, remember my print magazine article? Well, down below on that same page, yeah, that groovy sequence. Back to Cathedral Perilous. Here's a beautiful dome shot, fight scene, Manhunter at the top there with the blue clones. And Goodwin added this sort of background character of the little kid with his mother and father, tourists, and how he gets sort of involved with Manhunter's fight. But you can see in the next page, the kid's gun helps save the day. As you can read and follow. By golly, Emma, today's convinced me you're right. Mosques, cathedrals, after a while, they all look alike. But Dad, to Duel the Master next. Years later, in one of the Manhunter collections, Archie Goodwin wrote an afterword, and he talks about how Walt liked the look of a particular building on Park Avenue that we often pass going to and from DC. He thought out loud that it'd be an interesting thing to use for background sometime. With the reckless bravado of a man for whom nothing is impossible until he starts it, I said I'd construct a story around it. The story was, of course, Cathedral Perilous. That the actual building Park Avenue is, I think, a synagogue, didn't there for a month. Sorry, Archie. I quickly found, however, that it takes more than a building to make a story. While it was easy enough to come up with reasons for Manhunter Company to be romping through such an edifice, we were still left with a rather flat action yarn. In my usual inventive manner, I recalled Eisner and decided to bring in the tourist family, using the kid as a counterpoint to the main action, as was done several times in the Spirit. Walt and I both liked it and went with it. We wondered briefly if Eisner would mind us using one of his standard devices so blatantly, but reason, why would Will Eisner even ever look at his Spirit backup feature buried safely in a 100-page package of Detective? The matter was forgotten, the story completed. On to the punchline. When the Academy of Comic Arts had their annual awards dinner that year, Cathedral Perilous was one of the winners. The man who presented the award was Will Eisner. My acceptance speech was very brief and in a small, choked voice. less out of emotion than fear. Years have passed, and I've carried this burden with me. This seems the time to set their record straight. Mr. Eisner, we couldn't have done it without you. The next issue, under another beautiful apparel cover. I love the green sky. By the way, the Batman stories in the front of the issue, every issue, were great during Goodwin's run. If you're a fan of Alex Toth, the Thinking Man's artist, one of his greatest stories and greatest Batman stories, you can tell by the splash page alone, is in this issue. But we're here to discuss Manhunter. Another beautiful splash page, feeling like a film. Beautiful lettering by Simonson. Ah, look at this fight scene and coming down from the trees. I love the close-up panel of his eyes in the middle right. And just that beautiful pacing by Simonson. We get to the bottom of the page and a classic, almost pre-Quentin Tarantino showdown between the student and the master, Asano, who taught Manhunter. Remember, folks, this is 1974. Quentin Tarantino is still in his kid pants, doing who knows what. Was he even born then? I'm not sure. But anyway, I digress. But yeah, Simonson and Goodwin stage one of the great fight scenes in the Manhunter run that runs across a number of pages. And as I'm talking, I just hope you're taking in the beautiful storytelling, pacing by Simonson artistically. You know, I wish I could spend more time on each page, but I hope I'm giving you enough time to take in just Simonson's beautiful pen and ink work. I love the way he delineated Asano's outfit in those solid blacks with the white highlights, just beautiful. And just as Asano is about to deliver the death blow, he's interrupted overhead by Christine St. Clair with a bullhorn telling him to stand down and making him realize that Manhunter is not his enemy. And so we're left at the penultimate episode with Manhunter restored, teaming up with his master Asano and Christine St. Clair to take down the council in the next issue, titled Gotterdammerung, which I believe is German for end of the world. And in that final issue, released late summer of 1974, a year later, pretty much, after Manhunter's debut, the 7th installment would feature a beautiful Simonson splash page and his first rendition of Batman that excited all of us Batman fans, of course. There's Simonson's black and white original art, and just marvel at his beautiful expressive pen work, his delicate figure work, and yet delicate but no less dynamic. Most of that lettering in the bottom was done by Gaspar Saladino, it looks like, but it looks like Simonson, I bet you did Gotterdammerung on the top right. Look at how Simonson paces the first prologue page, the classic meeting between Commissioner Gordon and Batman in the rain. Now, only a couple months before, the great issue of Batman by Neil Adams and writer Denny O'Neil to bring back the Joker into the 1970s, one of the great Batman Joker stories of all time, opens up with Neil Adams' rendition of the classic Batman and Commissioner Gordon meeting in the rain. And you can see just by this example, not only how beautiful Neil Adams' artwork was, but how Simonson took on the same subject matter and just rendered it in his unique pen and ink drawing style. So confident, so sure of itself. The prologue leads to cutting to a scene in Wayne Manor, major party. The prime minister of the new African nation, Congola, a little play on Angola and the Congo. And yeah, there's another example of Simonson's beautiful type design, incorporating the crosshairs of a target with the Batman logo. Okay, drawn in April of '74. There's the date. And there's the entire page. Once again, some nice lettering on the left, very Eisner-like, very lively. The whoop, whoop, whoop of the whop, 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 I should say, of the silencer shots. And then the title page, Gotterdammerung. Again, an offbeat type style at the top. And look at how Simonson divides the folds of Batman's cape and turns them into panels, which, by the way, Neil Adams did, I think 5 or 6 years earlier, but I digress. Here's a nice action sequence. By the way, we were all so excited to see Simonson drawing Batman because we were all Batman fans, and this was Simonson giving us what every fan wanted to see. I mean, look at this dynamic figure of Batman in that first panel. The feeling of speed and motion, the dynamism of that angle, and again, the idiosyncrasy of the drawing. Look at how expressionistic that background is. Batman in shadows on the right. And then down below, look at the stylization of that cape. It wasn't realistic like Neil Adams, and it was stylized, which has gone on to influence everybody from Mike Kaluta to Todd McFarlane. I mean, look at this cape that Simonson has the nerve to draw. Marvel at the storytelling that brings your eye down to the final 2 panels. Again, that kind of cinematic cutting. Batman, don't let him get me. I'll tell you everything, but you got to protect me. The council ordered me to kill Kashumbo and excuse me, see that it led to Mabea. But look, he gets shot right in the back. And Manhunter, very matter-of-factly, introduced himself. I'm Paul Kirk. You may know me as Manhunter. Batman, I know you as a man said to be ruthless, but this is cold-blooded murder. As bad as the assassin you've killed. Well, of course, they get into a discussion. And by the end, I love that Batman head by Simonson on the left. But yeah, Manhunter lets Batman know that this is pretty serious, that they team up. And sure enough, Batman comes around and they shake on it and join forces. So they splinter off and Manhunter gets the SHIT kicked out of him by the Enforcer. Batman steps in, and man, does he let the Enforcer have it. And a nice little battle sequence right here. Whatever it made you completely the Enforcer, not the friend I call Dan Kingdom. Man, study the line work on Simonson's head there of Dan Kingdom. Just, that's a beautiful drawing, folks. And then he can go right to stylization and give us a graphic Batman like that. Almost like his cape is some organic amoeba-like blackness. You've seen it in special effects movies, right? Meanwhile, the Manhunter's been getting the SHIT kicked out of him now by Mikros, the head of the council. And in the final showdown, as you can see here, nice try, Mikros. You'd probably have burned me to a crisp. I wonder what I can do with it. And yeah, I guess that's the MacGuffin of the story, the helmet that could control the world or whatever the Archie Goodwin cooked up. I got to reread the Manhunter story, but as you can see at the end there, Micro stops him. Don't do it. You've heard us, but you shall not destroy us. Watch me. And somewhere beneath the earth, against the resisting minds of 5 frozen men struggling to preserve a corrupted vision, Paul Kirk fights his last battle. And the final page, beautiful, stylized Walt Simonson explosion. Beautifully colored too. Self-destruction doesn't strike me as the council's style, particularly if it didn't include us. Then it was Manhunter. He said they'd robbed him of the only piece he'd ever found. I suppose in his own way, he's taken it back. And that was the end of the Manhunter story. In the back of the issue were 2 beautiful pinups by Simonson, dated September of '73, of Manhunter. And how about that cape? Again, Simonson was the first post-Neil Adams Batman artist to treat the cape in this stylized manner, influencing really everybody. Well, maybe Kaluta predates him in '72, but that's another story. And yeah, that was the end of that landmark issue. And as you can see here in this promotional piece, when the Manhunter series was first published, it was hailed by comic fans and professionals alike as one of the most innovative series ever created. The Academy of Comic Book Arts awarded the series and creators 6 awards for a series of only 7 episodes. In '73, Best Writer, Best Short Story, Best Outstanding New Talent. In '74, Cathedral Perilous, Goddard Dameron, and Archie Goodwin wins Best Writer. And there's one of Simonson's great Manhunter sketches at the time. This full color pinup is dated 1977. Couple of years after the series ended. And by the end of the '70s into the '80s and beyond, DC Comics has printed multiple collections of this groundbreaking series by Goodwin and Simonson, as you can see here in this photograph I found on the internet of a collection of, I think, all of them. But let's start with Manhunter the Complete Saga, that I believe appears in 1979. So 5 years after the completion, DC puts out this collection. Here's a black and white ad that I found. This might have been in Steranko's Media Scene magazine, I'm not sure. And then I believe in 1984, we get this collected version, I think by the number 1. It was in a number of installments, but with a new Simonson cover, and there's his pencil for it. I love the little X's or indications of solid black to look like that. If you know the indie comics artist Fred Hembeck with his quirky, idiosyncratic, cartoony style, he did his homage of it. Inside that issue is where Goodwin commits to telling the story behind the creation of Manhunter. But man, whoever designed this and typeset it, that's really hard to read, folks. There's other versions of this in later editions. Here's another collection with coloring by Klaus Janson. And you can see that they took the art from DC's history comic of its characters called Who's Who. and they got Simonson to do a new drawing. This is probably early 90s, maybe. This same artwork was used as a frontispiece in a limited edition, beautiful collector's book that came out a few years ago, one of the giant oversized, tabloid size, really, artist edition, as they're called, by the company IDW, I believe. And behind a beautiful Simonson portrait of Manhunter, you get end papers that look like this one personally illustrated on and signed. And how's that for a title page? All of these IDW Artist Edition books are so beautifully designed. Over the years, Simonson has produced multiple drawings at conventions for fans, private commissions. Many of them are Batman and Manhunter teaming up. Here's a very recent one dated 2021. I don't have a date on this one, and I don't have a high resolution of it, but I do have a higher resolution of how it was mocked up, as if this could have been or should have been the cover instead of the apparel cover. And I don't have a date on this, but these are the little treasures you find when you're mining for gold on the internet, right? But here's a beautiful Simonson Batman combined illustration that was used for the hardcover collection, maybe came out about 15 years ago, maybe. Collecting all of Archie Goodwin's various Batman stories with all those different great artists. And here's another Batman Manhunter illustration by Simonson for the definitive deluxe edition, comic book size, that came out again, maybe just in 2022, possibly. There's the black and white original art by Simonson. You can see how much color adds to an illustration, right? And the contents double page spread, and you can see how they collect the entire series, plus a final chapter that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. But in this collection, we've got both of their bios in the back with a beautiful drawing by Simonson. We saw before the portraits, but you can see one of many of Simonson's black and white ink drawings, magic marker sketches of this unique, totally unique character, Manhunter, that Simonson's been doing sketches of for the last 50 years. And I've collected many of them for your viewing pleasure. I purposely printed this one light enough so you could see the blue lines of the paper that Simonson was drawing on. And the only reason why this nice drawing of Manhunter kneeling is in very low resolution is that it's a tight close-up of the three-dimensional figure model. Now, maybe this is about 10 years old, I'm not sure, but yeah, there it is in close-up. And there it is with its print advertising signed by Simonson. Just today, when I was putting the finishing touches on this webinar, somebody posted this picture of their Manhunter collectibles, and you can see DC made an action figure on the top shelf there. Now, of course, Manhunter wasn't the only art or feature that Simonson worked on. It was just his debut. It's what made his bones. In the early 80s, DC Comics put out a book, The Art of Walter Simonson, just collecting his work for DC Comics up to that point. I want to show you the back cover just because the writer Howard Chaykin in his introduction quoted my quote from Print Magazine. Walt Simonson was one of the first artists to introduce an unorthodox drawing style to mainstream superhero comics. His line was looser, sketchier, more graphic. So I'm really honored that I'm a little bit of a part of this first art book collecting Simonson's DC work. A year after the conclusion of Manhunter, he redefined his version of Batman, one that would prove to be super influential on all artists, especially guys like Frank Miller. He restored the pointy-eared, smaller-eared Batman, the grinning Batman with that devilish grin, the super violent Batman in the lower left panel, the demonic Batman. You can see the influence this Batman had on artists from Tim Sale to, again, Frank Miller, Dark Knight, the stylized cape. Simonson has gone on ever since to become really one of the great Batman artists of all time. I think this might be his greatest Batman cover with the Joker. I love the way the type wraps around the building like that, very three-dimensional. He did a solo Batman story written by Len Wein called Once Upon a Time that begins with the classic cliche, "It was a dark and stormy night." And this is another story with very minimal dialogue. Simonson would take older DC heroes like Dr. Fate on the left, drawn here in 1965 by the great Murphy Anderson. But 10 years later, in 1975, Simonson would update him with his stylized line and just reinvigorate the character. Beautiful lettering there at the top. He would be the only writer-artist to take Jack Kirby's early 70s fourth world characters like the New Gods, and after so many lesser artists and writers had tried to do their versions of New Gods, I think only Simonson did it right and did it well with his version of Orion. You can see the homage on this trade magazine draw. But there's the first issue. I believe it came out in 2001, or did it come out earlier? Maybe 1999. But yeah, if you don't know the series, Simonson pulls out all the stops, both graphically and storytelling wise. You get, of course, the great Dark Side and double page spreads that are Simonson at its most psychedelic. And I mean, just look at this incredible, stylized, beautiful, beautifully drawn, beautifully inked, beautifully colored. Now, why am I showing you only half of his Orion? Because the other half is the other series that Simonson would go on to do, also debuting 40 years ago this week, his version of Thor. By the way, in this trade magazine, comic artist that debuted in 1999, so the 10th issue must have been in the early 2000s. But yes, that's my logo, comic book artist, based on the old Action Comics logo. So I'm proud to say that my art, again, is a small part of Simonson's great work. But yes, 40 years ago this week, 10 years after Manhunter, Simonson at Marvel redefines Thor for an entire new generation. And his multi-year run on the title has proven to be, for a new generation, their definitive Thor, to the point where recent collections honoring Simonson's work feature Thor above all the other works that he'd done. I mean, in the 90s, he had a great run on the Fantastic Four. Must have been a dream come true for him, being such a Kirby fan. I actually love his version of the Hulk that he's done on a number of occasions. Maybe this is my favorite full color version that he both penciled and inked. But yeah, look at this Hulk pencil. He really captures the Steve Ditko aspect of the character from 1962. But yeah, it always comes down to Manhunter, the character that made Simonson's bones. So it's only fitting that I bring this webinar to a conclusion by featuring one of those collections of Manhunter, the special edition that came out in 1999, a year after Archie Goodwin passed away. And in this special edition, Simonson writes an afterword, and he talks about how they had planned the story for years. And you can see as I'm talking that Simonson talks about how they never finished it. And then Archie was gone. And as you can see, Simonson says he'd been ill for years. And although in retrospect, the toll his illness took is unsurprising, I was, like all his many friends, stunned by his death. I hadn't completed the layouts, and consequently, some modern weapons reference, a few cover-ups. Now, when he died, I had a lot of wonderful memories, some modern weapons reference, a few cover-ups, a page and a half notes, and that was all. But he would finish it. And remember what Goodwin had said about the influence of Will Eisner. And you can see that this story would be not only the final chapter of Manhunter, but their final homage to Eisner in memory of Archie Goodwin. So I'm not going to show you, I believe it was a 24-page story, maybe even longer, but I'm going to give you kind of the greatest hits that you could see Simonson's mature style at his zenith. I believe the colors, I think, are by Klaus Janson. But yeah, you can see how using pure imagery and that idea of comics as frames of a film. And at other times, like a master director, you can just change camera views like an expert editor, cutting back and forth. And using that final bottom right panel where the viewer's eye rests for the most impact. The innovative sound effects that were a hallmark and still are of Simonson's work. Look at how the shuriken are integrated with the whoop, the pating, delicate, bam, bam. I mean, just beautiful, right? So no dialogue, just sound effects, pure action, pure storytelling by Simonson. Look at the beautiful cinematic treatment of the 4 panels on the bottom right. I love the thud. You feel it. Batman's grimace, so stylized. And there's Asano, Christine St. Clair. Look at this cinematic sequence that Simonson draws. Somehow, I forget the story. They point to the Gotham City limits. And Batman finds a crumpled up piece of paper. Huh. Yeah, folks, read the story, but this is how the story ends in a beautiful, first of all, how about that stylized Batman cape, right? But yeah, they pay homage to that very first installment 50 years ago this week, folks. The debut of Manhunter by Archie Goodwin and Walt Simonson. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. If you go to my website, arlenschumer.com, you'll see that I have a kind of a twin career as both a comic book style illustrator and historian. One of the subpages is my comic book history page, which has information and details on my book and how via its link to this page, you can order a copy signed and sketched in by me. And I tell you, this book, if you don't have it, will rock your world and change your life. If you're on Facebook, come join my 3 comics history books. One devoted to the Silver Age, one just on Jack Kirby's work, and one just on the artist that influenced me the most. I got to work for him, and I've honored his work with so many projects. Influenced my drawing style the most as an illustrator working in a comic book style. This is the homepage of my website. If you scroll down, you'll see all of my best illustrations in various categories for easy viewing. You can see my recent Tony Bennett homage illustration of him as the personification of the great American songbook. My website is linked to my TeePublic page, the commercial website that features over 125 of my illustrations in every knick-knack, gewgaw, thingamabob, and application you could think of. So support your local artists, folks, your local freelance artists. My visual lectures and webinars page is linked to both my YouTube channel, which features the videos I post of webinars like this. And you can see my most recent webinars going back a year. I did 9 memorial webinars for Neil Adams after he passed in April. My Vimeo channel has all the webinars that YouTube's lawyers flag for using copyrighted material. So thank God for Vimeo. I have, you can see 14 of my other webinars there. And if you go to my events blog, I always post my comings and goings with all the URL links that you'll need to get there. So thanks again, ladies and gentlemen, for being here at the 50th anniversary of Manhunter, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.